The whole room went quiet when she clicked to slide 7. Not the comfortable quiet of people paying close attention, the held breath quiet of people who didn't know what to do with their hands. She presented for 41 minutes. I sat 3 rows back and counted every time she said my vision without blinking. My name is Isabel Merritt. I was 29 years old, a brand strategist at Hartfield Creative in Chicago, and I had just watched my director present my entire campaign concept to the biggest client our agency had ever pitched. Every slide, every word. The line I'd stayed up until 2 a.m. on a Thursday to get exactly right. The font choices I'd argued for in 3 separate internal reviews. The tagline I'd written on a post-it note and stuck to my laptop 6 months earlier because I was afraid I'd lose it before I figured out what to do with it. She said my vision 17 times. I stopped counting after 17 because I thought I might break the pen in my hand. Her name is Cecily Brandt. She'd been at Hartfield for 11 years when I arrived, which in agency years means she had built the kind of institutional power that looks like leadership from a distance and feels like gravity when you're inside it. She didn't create things. That was not, in the 3 years I'd worked under her, something I ever saw her do with any real consistency. What she did was absorb. She would sit across from you in a one-on-one, quiet and attentive, asking follow-up questions in a way that made you feel heard, and then she would carry that understanding into a conference room and present it back to people who had never met you. I had brought her the Cascade concept in October. Cascade Home was a regional retail chain out of Columbus, Ohio. 8 stores, mid-market positioning, a loyal customer base that was quietly aging out while younger shoppers drifted toward Target and HomeGoods. They needed a rebrand that didn't feel like a rebrand, something that elevated without alienating. I'd spent 5 months on it, not just evenings and weekends. On the train in and out of the city, on my lunch breaks, in the shower at 6 in the morning when pieces of it started clicking together in ways I hadn't expected. The concept I built was called the Everyday Elevated. The idea was to reframe what Cascade already sold, blankets, kitchen goods, furniture you'd find in any mid-range store, as the deliberate choice of someone who had learned to value their home. Not aspirational in the way luxury brands are aspirational. Aspirational in the quieter way that makes you feel like you're already doing it right. The campaign would run across digital, in-store experience, and a regional out-of-home push, and I had modeled a 30% increase in average basket size within 18 months if we executed correctly. I laid all of it out for my director in a 2-hour one-on-one in November, walked her through every decision and the reasoning behind it. She asked good questions. She always asks good questions. I will give her that. And when I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This is really strong. Let me sit with it before we take it to the client." 3 weeks later, Cascade's leadership team flew in from Columbus. I was not in the room. I watched the recording they made for internal archive purposes. I watched my director stand at the front of our largest conference room in a dark burgundy blazer, with my slides behind her and my language coming out of her mouth, and I felt something I can only describe as the floor dropping out from under me while I was still expected to stand on it. Cascade signed a 3-year contract worth $3.8 million. My director was promoted to VP of Brand Strategy 8 weeks later. I received an email from her the afternoon of the announcement that said, in full, "Isabel, wanted to make sure you know how much your behind-the-scenes support made this possible. This is a real team win." I read it twice. Then I closed my laptop, walked to the bathroom on the 4th floor where I knew no one from my department would be, and I stood at the sink with the water running cold and gave myself exactly 4 minutes to feel everything I was feeling. Then I went back to my desk. I did not send a reply all. I did not request an urgent meeting. I did not pull up my LinkedIn and start composing something that would feel righteous to write and devastating to regret. I had worked too hard and too carefully to let a single moment of justified fury make me the one who looked unstable. What I did instead was quiet and far more deliberate. I created a folder on my personal drive and named it, without any drama, 2022 Project Files. Into it went everything. The original creative brief with my name in the header and a timestamp from the prior February, the Slack thread where my director had asked me to walk her through the full positioning rationale. One more time before Thursday. 3 rounds of email drafts I had sent her with subject lines like Cascade Concept, Revised Framework V3, that would have been difficult to mistake for anything she had written herself. I had the mood boards. I had the copy decks. I had a 3-page written brief that I had formatted, authored, and sent to her as a Word document with my initials in the file name. I saved all of it, zipped it, and then I went back to doing excellent work. That part matters more than it might sound. The documentation was essential, but the work was what would make the documentation meaningful. Because the thing about being quiet when you have every right to be loud is that the silence only buys you anything if the work underneath it keeps building. If I had gone still in every direction, stopped producing, stopped showing up, started collecting grievances instead of clients, the silence would have looked like defeat. Instead, I stayed exactly who I had been before my director walked into that conference room. The person who made accounts work, who asked the right questions in strategy reviews, who account managers texted on a Friday afternoon when something wasn't landing and they couldn't figure out why. I built a reputation inside that building, steadily the same way I had always built things, from the inside out. My director's next major project was a pitch she'd named Northgate, a luxury home goods brand out of Greenwich, Connecticut, expanding into the Midwest market. The potential contract was $5.2 million over 2 years, the kind of visibility that would put Hartfield on a different tier of agency. She didn't ask me to be on the pitch team. I wasn't surprised. I think on some level she understood what it would mean to have me in a room where her instincts would be tested against mine. She staffed Northgate with 4 people who reliably agreed with her in meetings, which was a quality she had always selected for. The pitch process took 7 months. I watched it from the outside, doing my own work, hearing things the way you hear things in a small agency. Sideways, in the kitchen, in the particular vague language people use when they're worried, but don't want to be the one who said so first. The person who was direct with me was a senior account manager named Darnell Towns. He had been at Hartfield longer than almost anyone else and had a gift for seeing around corners without getting himself in the way of what he saw. About 8 months after the Cascade signing, we were getting coffee in the lobby cafe on a Wednesday morning, and he said, without any preamble, Cascade's brand manager called Graham last week. They're asking questions about the campaign direction. Graham Ashby was our CEO. Measured, methodical, not given to alarm, which meant that when something reached his desk, it had usually already been several other people's problem for a while. "What kind of questions?" I said. Darnell looked at his cup. "The kind where they've been given work that doesn't look like what they said yes to." I nodded slowly. I did not look surprised because I was not. What I felt was something more layered than surprise. The quiet recognition that the thing you had seen coming had in fact arrived on schedule. Here is the part I have thought about many times since. What my director had done with the Cascade campaign was not simply take credit for it. She had taken the concept, the language, the positioning, and then, over 11 months of execution, had slowly reinterpreted it in ways that made it feel like hers. Which sounds, on the surface, like how creative work evolves inside agencies. Except that her reinterpretations had stripped out exactly the things that made the original idea hold together. The deliberate restraint in the visual language, the specificity in the copywriting, the careful balance between elevated and accessible that the entire concept depended on to not tip into either pretension or discount store genericness. She had, in wanting to make it feel like hers, made it feel like nothing in particular. I kept doing my job, I kept documenting my work, and I waited. The call came 11 months after the Cascade signing. It was Graham's assistant who reached out first, and when I walked into his corner office on a Tuesday afternoon in October, he got to the point in under 2 minutes. "Cascade is 60 days from a formal contract review," he said. "Their VP of marketing has asked, specifically, to work with the strategist behind the Everyday Elevated." When I asked Cecily who that was, she gave me your name. He said it without emphasis. He was watching me the way careful people watch, when they're not yet certain what they're looking at. I let a moment sit in the air between us. The kind of moment where what you say next will matter for a long time. "I'm glad to help," I said. "But I want to come in as the lead strategist on Cascade, not in a support capacity. And I want that in writing before I open a single file." He agreed. I don't think he had any serious intention of not agreeing. He was 60 days from losing a $3.8 million contract, and someone had just told him who actually understood it. When the paperwork was signed, I sent Graham one email. Brief. One attachment, which was a zip file containing the original creative brief, the Slack thread, 3 rounds of email drafts, and the version history of every document I had sent my director in the months before the Cascade pitch. 2 short paragraphs in the body. No editorializing, no requests. I simply told him what he was looking at and let him draw his own lines between the points. The subject line was, "Background on the Cascade concept for your reference." I sent it on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I could feel the shift in the building the way you feel weather changing. Things got quieter in certain directions and more active in others. The kind of atmospheric change that happens when something that was hidden is no longer hidden, and people are quietly figuring out where to stand. My director came to my desk late that afternoon. I heard her before I saw her. The particular rhythm of her heels on the floor that I had, without meaning to, memorized over 3 years of working under her. She was wearing a gray blazer, and her voice had the careful brightness of someone holding something very heavy and not letting it show in her face. "I heard you're taking the lead on Cascade," she said. "That's genuinely wonderful. It was always your concept. I hope you know I've always said so privately." I looked up from my screen and held her gaze for a long moment. "You called it your vision," I said, 17 times in the Cascade pitch. I watched the internal recording. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. More like the specific expression of someone who had told a particular story about themselves for a long time and was now standing in a room where the story had stopped working. "Isabel," she started. "I'm not implying anything," I said. "Graham has the original brief. He has the timestamps. He'll reach his own conclusions." She stood there for what felt like a significant amount of time. Long enough that I could hear the ventilation system cycling in the ceiling above us. "We could work through this," she said finally. Her voice had dropped. The brightness had gone out of it completely. "The way it was before, you and me, we were a good team." I stood up, gathered the folder on my desk, and looked at her with something that was neither cruelty nor warmth. "We were never a team," I said. "I was doing the work, you were presenting it." I walked out and left her standing next to my empty chair. The weeks that followed moved with the particular momentum of things that have been building for a long time finally finding their level. Graham authorized an internal review that pulled communications, file timestamps, and version histories from the server. What the review surfaced was what I had known it would. A clear record of authorship predating anything my director could point to as her own contribution, and a pattern in the Northgate pitch process of promised deliverables that had gone unaddressed and client feedback that had never been escalated to leadership. She was placed on administrative leave within 2 weeks. She resigned before the review formally concluded. 2 members of her Northgate team, the ones who had spent months nodding along in meetings when the work should have prompted harder questions, left the agency quietly in the weeks that followed, citing other opportunities. Which is the language people use when the structure they were loyal to collapses, and they'd prefer not to be associated with what it leaves behind. I rebuilt the Cascade account in 9 weeks. I went back to the original framework, the version from my February brief, with the visual restraint and the copy calibration intact, before execution had diluted both of them. And I refined it with everything I had learned from 11 months of watching a client react to work that missed the mark. The fall campaign launched on schedule in November. The following March, Cascade Home won an Effie Award in the regional retail category. I flew to New York for the ceremony with the account team, and I stood in a room full of industry people. And when the announcer called Hartfield Creative's name, I walked to the stage, and I accepted the award, and I said thank you into a microphone with my name on it in my own voice in front of everyone who was there. Graham was in the audience. He wasn't the kind of CEO who made large gestures in public, but afterward in the lobby, he shook my hand and said quietly, "Good work, the real kind." I said thank you, the way you say it when you mean it plainly, without any asterisks. A few months later, the agency created a new director of brand strategy role as part of a broader restructure. They offered it to me. I was 29 years old, the youngest person to hold that title in the agency's 22-year history. When the announcement went out, Darnell sent me a text that said only, "Called it." I still have the folder on my personal drive. 2022 project files, unmodified, with everything exactly where I placed it. I've opened it once since everything happened. Briefly, just to confirm the zip file was still intact. I haven't opened it since. I don't expect I'll need to. The thing I return to most, when I think about those 11 months of waiting, the months of watching and documenting and keeping my head down and building things in my own name in a quieter corner of the building, is that none of it was elegant in the way that revenge stories are supposed to be. There was no scene of dramatic confrontation with an audience watching. No speech that landed perfectly. No moment where a room full of witnesses turned to look at me and understood, all at once, what had actually happened. What there was instead was work, documentation, patience, a folder with an unglamorous name, and the belief, not certainty, I want to be honest about that, but the belief that creative work carries its author's fingerprints in ways that are difficult to fully transfer. That the way my director had executed the Cascade campaign exposed what she didn't understand about it. And what she didn't understand was the thing that had come from the inside of the idea. The instinct behind every restraint, the reasoning behind every specific word choice, the thread of logic that connected the strategy to the execution, to the feeling the campaign was supposed to produce in the person standing in a Cascade store on a Saturday afternoon, deciding whether to spend $80 on a set of dish towels. You can absorb someone's idea. You can present it, claim it, let it raise your title and your salary and the office you get moved into. But if you don't understand why every decision was made, the work will eventually say so. Not in some abstract, poetic way, in the specific practical way where the client calls the CEO and asks why the campaign doesn't feel like it felt in the pitch. The loudest voice in the room is not always the one that lasts. Sometimes the voice that lasts belongs to the person who, when the meeting ended and the lights came back up and everyone filed out, went back to her desk and kept working. I still keep my original notes from the Cascade concept in a separate folder from everything else. The post-it note with the tagline "I was afraid I'd lose" is still stuck to the inside cover of a notebook in my desk drawer. I've looked at it a few times since the Effie ceremony. Not to remind myself that it was mine, just because even now I'm still glad I wrote it down.